Hi, I'm Carmen Alana Tibbets. Welcome to part 2 of working with bird heads and beaks. Joining me in the studio today is this Parallaxia figure, and he has a leather beak, which is typical of the bird figures that I make. But before we start talking about how to make this guy's beak, I want to talk about the pros and cons of working with leather because I think there's some important considerations. On the positive side, it's very easy to make complex shapes like this one. So for example, this guy has a curved top and bottom beak with a pointy tip, and that's actually pretty easy to do. The finished beak has a very realistic texture that looks just like the surface of a real beak, which is really nice. The finished beak is very lightweight, so your figure is not going to be top heavy and prone to tipping forward, which is good. And because it's leather, it's very compatible with any other textile techniques that you might be using to sculpt the rest of the head. On the negative side, there's a limited number of color choices in the leather that's easily available. I get my leather at thrift stores, and most of it is black, sometimes brown. I'm lucky if I can find a gray or a beige. So unless you want to dye the leather, which is really kind of messy and just too time consuming for me, you're limited to that neutral color palette. The second one, and it's a big one, is that it's really difficult to sculpt really small beaks or very thin, narrow beaks. And a good example of that would be a hummingbird. That kind of beak is just going to get very easily bent, and it's just going to be too big. It's not going to look good. So because this is leather, it can become scuffed and dented, and that can be a concern if you are shipping your figure. You have to protect the entire head and make sure that the beak isn't going to become pitted or scratched. Last but not least, the whole technique itself is very messy, and usually when I'm doing this, I'm going to make 10-15 beaks at a time because just get stuff all over, and you'll see what I mean about that in a second. So before we start getting into the actual methodology, I'm going to take a second and talk about what kind of leather you want to look for when you're purchasing leather. Okay, let's get started. When you go to a thrift store, you're going to find a lot of different kinds of leather garments, and there's really only one characteristic that you want to keep in mind if you're looking for leather to use for beaks, and that's flexibility. So I have a variety of different kinds of leather and suede here, different kinds of thicknesses, but they all share one characteristic, and that's that they are very flexible. So you can actually take it and tug on it, and it has some stretch, but also you can wrap it around your finger and pull hard, and you see that you can mold it very easily to different shapes. So this is a very thin black leather, and this is probably my favorite here, but all three of these have the same characteristics. You can pull them and you can tug them into shape. If you're looking at something thick, like that you might find on a purse or a shoe, it's not going to have that flexibility, and it's going to be difficult to use. It doesn't really matter what kind of texture you go for. These are both sort of natural, kind of just, I don't know, they're tanned, but they have a suede back, and they have different levels of texture, but they're both fine. This is actually what's called a split suede, and if you look at it carefully, you see that it has little tiny pores both on the front and the back surface, and what that means is that this was actually a thicker skin and they split it into multiple layers. And this is still fine. You have those little pores, but they're going to work out just fine for your leather. So just keep in mind you want to find something that's flexible. It doesn't matter how thick it is, and in fact if you take a look at these two leathers, I don't know if you can see this very well, but this brown stuff is maybe 3 times thicker than this black, but these are both very usable, and in fact this brown is one of my favorites, and I'm kind of running low on it, so I'm going to be kind of sad when I run out of that. So let's get started with some beaks. So the first thing you want to do is make the base of the beak, and I use closed cell foam, and it's kind of cushy. This is the stuff that you would use to go camping. I get it on big rolls, and you can sleep on this stuff, and you can go to Walmart and get a giant roll of it. And this is what I use to cut down to shape to make the base, what's underneath the leather of my beaks. So I'll cut it to shape, so sort of a general rectangle, and this is the part where it gets really messy. And you're just going to have to cut it. It's very easy to cut. It's not going to damage your scissors. And you're just going to cut it into whatever shape that you want. And then what you have to do is shape it with some other scissors and get a little bit more of a rounded shape. And this is going to take a while to get the shape that you want. And sometimes doing this with just a single layer isn't going to be enough. You need a thick beak, or you have some odd profile, and so what you'll have to do is get multiple pieces of foam and glue those together and then do the shaping. So once you do that, you'll have some pieces that will fit together. They'll be kind of the same size, and you can see that's very beak-like. You want to get the surface as smooth as possible, because if you have something like this, a little bit of a bump or a ridge, when you mold the leather over this surface, that ridge will show. So the next step after forming your shape, and you're going to have tons of this blue stuff everywhere, and it's staticky and it just gets everywhere, it's a total mess. Here I have a built-up shape. You're going to cover this with a layer of rubber cement, and you let that dry completely. You do the bottom. This will be the inside of the beak. And then you're going to cut some pieces of leather or suede to fit over the surface. And you just kind of get your leather, and you figure out how big you need it, kind of wrap it around gently and give yourself enough of an overlap. And then you cover this with 1 or 2 layers of rubber cement. You can see it changes the color on this one side, but not on the other side. And you want to let both of these dry. You don't want to try and glue the pieces together when the rubber cement is wet, because that's just not going to work. So you let it dry, you let it cure, and even though it's not tacky at all, these two things, they will stick together. So then what you're going to do is you're going to try and align everything with your overlap. Okay, and so it's just kind of, it's stuck in place there, and you can see that it's sticking pretty good. And then you're going to pull this, and this is where the flexibility and the moldability comes into play. You're just going to pull this tightly over the surface of the foam. And so the great thing about having the rubber cement already dried and the stickiness is that when I pull it and I tug it, it just stays in place. So you keep doing this, and you just kind of pull it into place, and then at the tip, because the leather is also rubber cemented, the leather will stick to itself, you can see here. So you just kind of mold it into shape, and you keep doing that. And if you don't get it right, you can pull the leather off, but you'll have to add another layer of rubber cement to everything before you re-glue it. So you're going to do that for both of the pieces, and then you're going to have something that looks like this. And in this case, I didn't do enough rubber cement here, so it's not sticking. But that's okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to trim all this extra off. And I usually use, oh, sorry, got that out of the frame. I usually use a long pair of scissors. I think that's easier. And it's going to take a couple passes. And when you're cutting, you actually want to cut past the tip of the beak, past the edge of the foam, and you can feel it. And you're just going to kind of cut flat like that, and get it as good as you can, and then go back with some smaller scissors and trim a little bit more. Okay, and what you want to get is you want to get the tip so you have a nice sharp point at the tip. And you can see here the leather is just barely sticking together. I should have put more rubber cement here and glued that, but you can see what I do wrong, and it still works out okay in the end. So you've got that tip, and then you want it to be as flat as possible. So we're going to do the same thing here. And then I'm going to trim this extra. So now we've got our two sides of the beak, and we're going to glue them together. And in this case, when we glue them together, we're not using rubber cement anymore. We're actually going to use tacky glue, because the rubber cement will not hold this long term. Because these two pieces, they kind of want to force themselves apart. At this point, if you needed some more curve on your beak, you can insert a wire in here, and you can do a little bit of curving because this foam is quite flexible. So you have, you have a lot of leeway with what you can do with what you have. So let's take a look at the glue and use our good old tacky glue, and I'm going to squirt some in here. And you don't want a huge amount of glue. And if the stuff squeezes out, you don't want the glue to show. So it is going to stain the leather a little bit. I did not do a good job on that piece of the beak. So then you're going to join these together. And the key for most bird beaks is getting this tip area to meet, to get it really close together. And you see here I have some glue squeezing out, and that's no good. We don't want that. So I'm going to put these scissor tips in here and then clean out some of this leather. Of course, I have glue all over my fingers now. You want to clean that out, get those tips together. So now here's one of the problems with leather. If I stick a pin in this, it's going to cause a stress point. And so you want to make sure that you have good contact all the way across and along and down the beak on both sides. So you kind of get this into position. It'll pretty much hold. Get rid of that glue. And you want to use the tacky glue or the double tacky glue. Get those tips together. And you don't have to worry so much about perfect tips at this point, because you can go back later. But what I do to hold this all together is I get a piece of knit fabric or a sweater, and I wrap the whole thing really tight, and I'm really pinching here. And I am not pinning through the leather, I'm only pinning through the fabric. But what I'm doing is I am creating pressure along the entire side of the beak. So you would just pull it. I'm sorry, I'm kind of making a mess of this, like I always do. Just pull it really tight and then pin along. So there's no pins in the leather, it's just pinning this whole thing closed like this. Then you'd set this aside to dry, and then you'd slip it out, and it would be all ready to go. You can trim off this extra here, and if it needs to, you can put a little bit more glue at the very tip. And there you are, you have a beak. And at this point, you would just cut off the edges. If it's not even here at the end, that's fine. You can just cut that flush. And then that would be inserted into the head as I showed you in video number 1.